This is our fifth and final part of my interview with Glenn Renwick. I'm Bindi from Journey, and for this final segment we'll be talking about going full circle and working with fintechs and startup companies. Obviously you have extensive experience in large corporate enterprises, but you also have experience in dealing with fintech companies, like being on the board of Fiserv for 19 years and as chairman for the last few, before stepping down recently in June. Are you able to give us a bit more background about some of these experiences?
Yeah, we'll start with Fiserv because it's relevant to your questions, but when I joined Fiserv, it was actually something that was far from sort of what we would call fintech, that we would use that definition today. We did check processing. So it's a great example of evolving through, it had its basis in the banking industry, and how did the banking industry evolve? And more importantly, how did Fiserv play a role in that evolution? And that was what was intriguing to me, and I joined the board partly so I would be a better CEO, to see things from the board perspective and then go back with my board, so that was one of my motivations. But one of the things I got from Fiserv was much more of an acquisition focused, because it's very hard to do everything yourself. You don't easily envision all the opportunities. And this is where the ecosystem of fintechs really comes, I think, together from my perspective, that we acquired a lot of very, very good companies, but became the integrator of them so that the end customers, the bank and their customers, were able to see a much bigger product suite than perhaps any one of the startup or smaller companies would have been able to make available. But on the other hand, Fiserv benefited from being able to take advantage of technologies and companies that weren't as constrained as a bigger company gets to be, and then focus on how do you integrate that into your distribution channel and into your value proposition. So it was a great example of seeing a highly acquisitive company relative to Progressive, where we were sort of developing almost everything internally, and seeing how those acquisitions were able to be integrated both from a business perspective and a culture perspective, and some of the issues that come along for the ride with those types of things. I wouldn't have gotten any other direct way. And I hope along the way my perspective was able to help Fiserv continue to become, to be a great company, but to become an even greater company. And latest significant acquisition, I hope will be a really, really big positive for all the banking system in the United States.
So you touched on this just now. What were some specific things you learnt from being on the board at Fiserv that you then were able to bring into your role as CEO?
Oh, I think that when you go through a lot of acquisitions, you learn. If you go through one or two, you may not learn as much, and you learn, perhaps you start off thinking price is one of the most important things. No one's going to minimize price in acquisition, but terms and understandings, especially post-acquisition, and culture. Are you going to have to be sort of fighting cultures, or are the cultures going to reasonably integrate? And very few are going to seamlessly integrate. And those are things that, when missed up front, regardless of the product, tend to end up not working out as well. If you get good product and a good cultural match, then that is sort of the sweet spot. So terms, and what I mean by terms, rather than just price, what is the post-sale kind of earn-out for perhaps owners or smaller owners? Because if you don't structure that correctly, then someone will be like, well, I maximize by doing this. Whereas the buyer might say, but I had this in mind. those kind of terms, whether it's governance, whether it's lots of things, they tend to be more important. The price is clearly important. Once paid, done, the terms stay with you for a lot longer.
Yeah, right. And now you've joined the board of Mentemia, which is a Kiwi mental health non-profit named after the Italian word for my mind. Can you give us a quick elevator pitch?
Sure. Kiwis, I think, and this is true for others as well around the world, are very focused on their physical fitness and health and well-being. That's fantastic. I'm not sure that we, or for that matter, necessarily anyone else, think quite the same way about mental fitness or mental health. And count me in that group, because that was not something that I had any real background in. But the fact is, life is coming at you pretty fast these days. And I can see it, and I certainly saw it in my last years at Progressive. I'll say younger people, but I don't think it's really age-bound, dealing with lots of social pressures, whether they sort of feel the need, obligation, guilt, whatever, of checking 3 or 4 social sites every day, balancing their family life, perhaps children having other issues with the school or social bullying, whatever it might be. Life really is coming at us pretty fast. And I don't think anyone has the solution to that, but there may be something that we can just spend a little bit more time and trying to make, and I'll say one, but it could be all of us being that one, regardless of where we start from. One person's better every day from just dealing with life, and a few techniques that just make things a little better. You may or may not know, John Kerwin has clearly been a face of mental health in New Zealand and has a very vested interest in this. And there are partners that he's met up with and started to develop a little business, and I'm excited to be along for the ride on that one, and hopefully can share some values that at the end of the day, people just perhaps feel like getting through life day to day is just a little easier.
Great. What else have you learned, or do you hope to learn from working with smaller startup companies?
I think the issues are the same. The magnitude and the prioritization is a little different. So I didn't worry about running out of cash as much at Progressive. You know, small business people have to worry about cash and making sure they make good decisions of prioritization, specifically on how to invest that and staying on topic, making sure they've got deliverables so that they can stay in business. We've talked a lot about culture in this conversation. Well, cultures sort of evolve and develop over time, but you can't wait till you're an established business to just develop it. In fact, it may be many of those values are really important at the startup phase. And I think being clear about what you want to be when you grow up. Are you going to be the next, we use the classic Googles and Amazons, or are you going to develop a product that can be extraordinarily useful to companies who have distribution and business models that surround a lot of excellent products, and maybe you fit into that at some stage of your maturity? Getting clear about that, maybe not from day one, but along the way, will allow you to focus on making the right decisions. And I expect I will learn even more, but I really think that people who start things from scratch, it's very hard to take a big ocean liner and turn it, and that's running a big company. But it's also hard to get it to start in the first place. And I think that while the skills are similar, there's a different emphasis at different times. And I'm really looking forward to sort of learning how those skills adapt a little bit more to startups.
It's a great analogy that you gave. And has it changed your perception of innovation in any way?
I don't think it's changed my perception of innovation, other than startups are just less constrained, which I love. And that's why I say that it shouldn't necessarily be, and it's not the right end game for every company. That's far from the case. But in Fiserv's case, I'm not sure we could have developed some of the products that we ultimately bought and integrated nearly as well, and certainly not as quickly, as a group that was a little less constrained. It's almost like having internal incubators. And that model can really advance your bigger business model very well if you're on the receiving end. But if you're one of the more incubator type environments, and that's what you want to see as the trajectory, you can develop with an end game in mind, and that's fun as well. But just the lack of constraint, a little less regulatory kind of oversight if it's something that's new to the marketplace, not being wed necessarily to backward integration to things that have been done before. If you join a company, then that becomes their problem to integrate. But just speed. Speed and market relevance, and using contemporary models, updating the technology. Sometimes for companies, we all like to talk about legacy systems and so on and so forth, but very hard to sit and rationalize why you would recode a legacy system. A lot of times what you do is surround it by newer technologies and make it a core that can support those newer technologies. All those things are just the benefits of smaller startups.
You touched just now on incubators, and more insurers are now partnering with insurtech companies in various forms. What are some common mistakes that you've seen insurtechs or insurers making when partnering?
I think there's probably others that have more experience on that, but from my experience, what larger companies that were partnering with a smaller insurtech tend to do is take it and say, this is pretty good, now let's get it modified to our way of thinking. And I have very specific examples where that is just an expensive and failed model. I think that if you do more and better due diligence up front to say, it may not be exactly how I would have done it, or maybe based on your knowledge, but it's good. Let's take it and try to take it in close to its current form rather than changing it. I think it's that battle to change and integrate that generally is unfulfilling for both sides, because one, the developer is not seeing it in its truest form or how they've envisioned it, and the company that's trying to integrate it generally goes through extraordinary pains to integrate things and to modify and change and customize and so on and so forth. I just think customization can be the kiss of death for these types of integrations. The product was great. I never customized it and integrated it the way it should have been done, and it falls by the wayside. My advice would be, don't buy it if you don't think you want to use it largely the way it was designed.
Going back to acquisitions then, you remain on the board at UnitedHealth, the world's largest health insurance company. United also acquires a lot of technology companies. Why do you think that is?
I think it's very similar to the answers I've given. UnitedHealth has 325,000 employees. They're all busy. And they're terrific, and they do some incredible things internally, including in the technology area. But there are always startups that are looking at the market just a little bit differently. That 30-degree turn of curiosity that we talked about, or 90-degree turn of curiosity, sometimes doesn't come from within the big company. It may or may not be sort of something they can envision, But it's hard to prioritize relative to the other activities. And it may very well be better to actually buy and integrate than be a development arm for yourself for every single thing. Certainly there has to be a lot of internal development, no question about that. They have great knowledge, they have great understanding of the marketplaces, so on and so forth. But there are opportunities that come along, and they come along pretty readily, where someone has done something and you go, that's great. That is, if we set out to do that or something similar, it would cost a lot of money, time, and the question is that where you want to spend that money and time? It's not whether or not you could do it slightly cheaper than the acquisition price. It's, is that the best use of limited resources?
Yep.
So really, people who actually develop new or variants of business models or attack small pieces of the marketplace can be extraordinarily valuable to an integrator that wants to attack a bigger part of the marketplace. I think that's true for UnitedHealth.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for insurance executives when it comes to working with fintech startups, technology companies in general?
I just go back to my advice. Don't, if you're going to work with them, don't try to change them. Try to see how your model and their model can integrate reasonably well. If it feels like it's got a lot of friction for whatever reason, not necessarily bad reasons, you're probably going to pay a multiple more than you're currently thinking when you're excited about the first look at the model.
So although you've now retired from Progressive, you're clearly still very busy with many hats on boards and advisory roles and teaching as well, as I've learnt today. What are your goals for the future?
Yeah, I still, it was the right thing for me after my tenure at Progressive to hand over to someone that I had developed for another 20 years. It was a lady, and so it was good and healthy, I think, for everybody. Not to say that you sort of ever think you get the timing right. I could have stayed longer, whatever. But I want to try. I've been very lucky. I've had people that have helped me along the way. I've had everything from academic help to business help. So now I actually want to give back in any way that I can. So I do teach a little bit at the University of Florida Engineering School, and I just did a little something with an entrepreneurial entity at the University of Canterbury, and hope to continue to have relationships there and the boards. And I think adding, and you've mentioned Mentemia, adding small businesses may be a very interesting opportunity to have a different point of view from sort of large scale and seeing how that matches with small scale, and knowing you don't have all the answers, but you may have some that would help people gain some knowledge earlier in the development life cycle of a business. I think we've all probably said, gee, I wish I knew then what I know now. In some sense, I'm trying to sort of see if I can play a role in advancing that a few years.
Yeah, great. So that rounds off the interview. Thank you so much, Glenn.
Thank you.
For taking the time and let me pick your brain and having us into your beautiful Wanaka home. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure there are some fantastic gems of advice and interesting commentary for our viewers.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.